Welcome to the Burning Archives History of the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's a unique perspective on the cultural history of the modern world. I'm reading every single one of the Nobel Prize for Literature winners since 1901, and in this video I'm looking at the winners from 1996 to 2002, who all in various ways came to terms with some of the tragedies of the 20th century and difficult moral challenges of thinking about the history of these traumatic events. In 1996, the winner was the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska. She was a great Polish poet who endured Polish nationalism, German occupation, and Polish and Soviet communism, and the heady days of post-communist hyper-liberal Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, she kept her distance from all ideologies. One observer once commented that she lived her life as if she were an extraordinary woman doing the performance, the impression of an ordinary woman. Her poetry reversed expectations about what is really important. It is a humble view with a grain of sand, as described in one of her great poems and the title of her collection, published in English after she won the Nobel Prize. In her poetry, it's not capital A art or capital P politics or capital H history. It is private revelations that are often more important than big ideas. She had an admiring but modest, humble view of the inspiration of the poet. In her Nobel acceptance speech, she said, "Inspiration is not the exclusive privilege of poets or artists generally. There is, has been, and will always be a certain group of people whom inspiration visits. It's made up of all those who've consciously chosen their calling and do their job with love and imagination. It may include doctors, teachers, gardeners, and I could list 100 more professions. But it's all brought together. Whatever the inspiration is, it's born," she said, "from a continuous I don't know." She had an interesting biography embracing socialist realist aesthetics in the 1950s, but after the post-Stalinist thaw in the Soviet bloc in 1956, she maintained her distance from all ideologies. She only published 350 poems in her long life. Many of the best are collected in this book here, Map, Collected and Last Poems. And once asked why so few poems, she said she had a trash can at home. You could throw out the bad ones. You gotta love that about a writer's sense of their real importance in the world. She is my favourite poet, as I explain over at my Substack this week, jeffrich.substack.com. You can read that post for free by subscribing over there, so why don't you do that right now? And in the post, I also describe the brilliant poem, The End and the Beginning, which you can also listen to my reading of here on YouTube at the video right there. The 1996 winner was Dario Fo from Italy. He was a playwright, comic satirist, even perhaps a performance artist or comic actor. His most famous play is Accidental Death of an Anarchist, which I can recall seeing, posters for when I was at university. I've never seen it, and I haven't been able to find a copy to read this week, but I have sampled his plays together with that of his collaborator, Franca Rame, A Woman Alone, and other plays, and I'll read a little bit from one of those a little bit later. He was a critic of power, especially the conservative establishment that ruled Italy after 1945, which Fo from a radical position, saw as the inheritance of fascism and authoritarianism. This comes out in two quotes from Dario Fo. He wrote, there is no greater equalizer than the stupidity of men, especially when those men have power. And he also said that politicians' fiction mechanisms are immune to trauma. In the 1960s, he began appearing doing political comic skits on Italian television. This makes him perhaps a unique and maybe controversial choice as a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. However, it did reflect an old Italian tradition of the commedia dell'arte and 20th century theatrical concepts. His plays relied on improvisation. It was part of the idea of radical theatre in the post-war period, particularly that drama was a collective work, as much the product of the actors and the set producers as the mind of the playwright, the aristocratic mind of the playwright. His work of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s is peppered with criticisms of assassinations, corruption, organised crime, racism, Roman Catholic theology and war. That was Italy. That was a lot of Europe in that period, the years of lead among them. In the 1990s and 2000s, he lampooned Forza Italia and its leader, media tycoon Silvio Berlusconi. And in the 2010s, he criticised the banks amidst the European sovereign debt crisis, as well as various theories about big events in the world. In the 2010s, he indeed became an ideologue of the Five-Star Movement that became quite a significant political force for a while, led by comedians in Italy. He was also an opponent of the state, and the play Questions of Terrorism and Repression, which he wrote together with Franco Rome, is a monologue of Ulrike Meinhof from the Baader-Meinhof gang. Now, I'm just going to read the last bit of that play. Of course, Baader-Meinhof, the Baader-Meinhof gang was the German terrorist group from the Red Brigade from the 1970s. Notorious, and Ulrike Meinhof was in jail. I think she died in jail. And there is this monologue where Dario Fo gives her, I guess, some moral authority in criticising conventional conformists in Western society. The state has uncovered the paralysing mirror of terror. Our own corpses are reflected in that mirror. One look at your own reflection and you're numbed, deep, frozen, alive. But those of you who accept these conditions, who have darkness in your minds, who let your consciences fall asleep, who look for a life without problems, a quiet life, I ask you, are you really sure you're still alive? Perhaps even more relevant, a comment in this day and age. However, whether Dario Fo's political commentary is really that forceful, whether the Five-Star Movement was really that much of a success, is open to debate. Writers, even comic ones like Dario Fo, are rarely good at politics, however good they might be at jokes. In 1998, José Saramago from Portugal won the Nobel Prize. The committee honoured his parables sustained by imagination, compassion and irony with which he continually enables us once again to apprehend an illusory reality. These allegories commonly presented subversive perspectives on historic events. Saramago was an atheist and a libertarian communist. He was a lifelong member of the, until his death, of the Portugal Communist Party long after the end of the Cold War. A number of his works offended religious institutions who were backed by the government of of Portugal to crack down on José Saramago, the publication of Saramago's works in Portugal. As a result of this political censorship, he went into exile in Spain in the 1990s. He was a long advocate of free speech to defend culture. Remember that. He worked most of his life as a journalist and achieved fame only late in life, around 60. Hope for us all. But he was prolific, producing novels or other works nearly every year from the mid-1970s. Among those better-known works is Blindness from the 1990s. I could only sample this work, Cain, which is a retelling of the story of Abel and Cain, which is commented on as quite a controversial novel. One can probably imagine that even more so today. I also sampled his memoir, Small Memories, that focuses very much on his childhood. I sensed the skill of his writing and of his parables. Harold Bloom described him as part of the Western canon, as one of the primary novelists of the 20th century. I'm not so sure. He doesn't really move me. Nonetheless, here is a quick quote from José Saramago's novel, Blindness. You never know beforehand what people are capable of. You have to wait. Give it time. It's time that rules. Time is our gambling partner on the other side of the table, and it holds all the cards of the deck in its hand. We have to guess the winning cards of life, our lives. I'm not sure I'm going to give José Saramago that much more time for my reading. I'm going to choose some other winners from the 120 Nobel laureates since 1901 to read over the next year or so. But if you are a great admirer of Saramago's work, do let me know what is so great about him in the comments below. In 1999, Günter Grass from Germany won the Nobel Prize. He was a novelist, poet, playwright who also practiced some visual arts as well. Indeed, he trained as a stonemason and sculptor in the 1950s. He was born in 1927, which meant he was a teenager during the end of World War II. And as with so many unfortunate adolescents and even children in Germany in World War II, he was drafted into the military towards the end of the war as the regime was collapsing, as it was losing the war. At the age of 17, he was drafted, and from late 1944, he served in the Waffen-SS, which was a fact that only really was only revealed really in his memoir much later in the 2000s. Nonetheless, he was taken as a prisoner of war by US forces in May 1945. These experiences no doubt fueled his imagination and were part of the basis of his most famous and perhaps greatest work, the 1956 novel Tin Drum. This book was pervasive when I was a child because a film had been made of it that was shown at all, or not when I was a child, when I was a university student, because a film had been made of it that was shown at all the art house cinemas, the Tin Drum, and it won the Oscar for the Best Foreign Film in 1979. The Tin Drum is described as a novel of European magical realism, and the Nobel Committee honoured this work as, I guess, the start of a new age in German culture. It said it was as if German literature had been granted a new beginning after decades of linguistic and moral destruction. Günter Grass went on to write a trilogy following on from Tin Drum, including Cat and Mouse and Dog Years, and this trilogy, known as the Danzig Trilogy, after the town where Grass grew up, and he set these novels that explored the rise of Nazism and experience of World War II. Rather like William Golding, the author of Lord of the Flies, Grass struggled to write a follow-up to his successful 1950s novel. Nevertheless, in later years, he wrote a series of memoirs which revealed, included the revelation in the early 2000s that he had served in the Waffen SS. He was always a controversial figure, and this made him even more controversial, a target for criticism from many conservatives, perhaps, Americans also, that he was a hypocrite. He'd always been a strong supporter of European social democracy, and his wartime service in the Waffen SS appeared to make him an easy target to be criticised as a hypocrite. But I'm not sure if that is really true or whether it's just the unfortunate, traumatic and difficult experience of his generation of Germans. He still practiced his art into his late life. And in this book here, Of All That Ends, which includes some of his sort of memoirs and late writings, there is a poem which I will just read, which is part of the post-war German process of coming to terms, reckoning with its history, its difficult history, whether it's really a unique history or whether it's a common experience of forgetting and working through horrible political events. Before it's too late, let no one say, as too often in the past, we didn't know. Not one among the silent righteous will be spotless. No one can spend the week in silence and be absolved on Sunday. We must never again build memorials to victims we treated thoughtlessly. No one will look in the mirror without reflecting guilt. The shame in flower pots is rooted in the past. That poem is very resonant of events today, and indeed it comes to terms with some of the moral challenges of reading the Holocaust, which are described in this brilliant book by Inga Clendinnen, Reading the Holocaust, the great Australian historian Inga Clendinnen, which I actually am reading sections from as audio mini books over at my Substack. If you take out a paid subscription for just $8 US a month to that Substack, you can listen to one of the most brilliant interpretations of that exact moral challenge that Günter Grass wrote about and which we all face today. In 2000, Gao Xingjian from China won the Nobel Prize. Gao Xingjian, my apologies if I'm not pronouncing that well, is a Chinese emigre writer who has been a French citizen, French national since 1997. He writes or wrote both plays and fiction and is a literary modernist inspired by both Chinese and Western literature, including the great absurdist playwrights of the mid-20th century, Antonin Artaud, Samuel Beckett and Eugene Ionesco. He is a critic of both the Chinese government and its critics. He espoused a perspective of no-ism, which is non-political. It doesn't follow politics, but it doesn't oppose people following politics. He claimed it's best to stand on the sidelines and not harbour wild dreams of dominating the world. Lots of people could learn that lesson right now. He was honoured by the Nobel Committee for an oeuvre of universal validity, bitter insights and linguistic ingenuity. And that those bitter insights in part were the experience of China from the 1960s to the 1980s, or his experience of China from the 1960s to the 1980s. He was perhaps also honoured because in 1997 he took out French citizenship after leaving China in 1987. As we've learnt, the Nobel Committee rather likes an émigré critic of opponents of the West. He wrote absurdist drama. He was, however, one of many victims of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In the early 1970s, he was persecuted as a public intellectual, forced to destroy his early writings, and was sent to the countryside to do hard labour in Anhui province for 6 years. That great collective trauma I commented on in my review of Tanya Brannigan's book, Red Memory, and the link to the video is just there. But he re-established himself and became, after the persecutions of the early 1970s, and became the resident playwright at the Beijing People's Art Theatre from 1981 to 1987. In 1986, however, a huge event occurred in Gao's life. He was misdiagnosed with lung cancer. He was told he had, 6 months to live, given a medical death sentence that proved to be wrong. He was rather like the characters in Dostoevsky, like Dostoevsky experienced himself, given a death sentence and then had that death sentence taken away from him. An extraordinary experience that Dostoevsky wrote about and Gao wrote about. He went after this event on a 10-month trek along the Yangtze, and this crisis led to this book, his novel Soul Mountain. Soul Mountain presents a part autobiographical, part fictional, part philosophical, part historical series of fragments that recount a man's journey together with an unnamed woman to the fabled mountain Lingshan, or Soul Mountain. It combines in 81 fairly brief chapters fragments, travel accounts, anecdotes from recent, ancient and recent Chinese history, references to Chinese and Western literature, particularly Dante and some of the people and some of the Buddhist texts, and much else besides. It's fragmentary and experimental, and as a result, an uneven and sometimes bumpy, sometimes rather dull ride. However, I didn't really enjoy the book. However, it did provoke my curiosity to explore Chinese history and literature in more depth. In some ways, it's a kind of Western, Chinese Western road movie or beatnik novel with a somewhat tiresome cult of the rebel artist as male sexual fantasist. But there were many passages in the novel I enjoyed, particularly how it reflected on, documented even, aspects of Chinese experience in the years during and following the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And I've got an article at my Substack that goes into more detail into Gao's Soul Mountain that you can read if you take out a paid subscription at jeffrich.substack.com, $8 US a month. I'd really love you to be part of the Burning Archive community over there at Substack, and you can read a little bit more about Gao's Soul Mountain and its sort of literary character. The 2001 winner was V.S. Naipaul. Naipaul was a Trinidad-born writer that the British claim as a British writer of fiction and non-fiction in English. He is known for his comic novels set in Trinidad, although he also wrote some bleaker novels exploring alienation of post-colonial communities in the West. He was greatly admired as a great prose writer, and He perhaps wrote rather too much, sometimes about his life, sometimes social commentary, and also some wonderful travel writing. His travel books are fantastic. I actually have a travel book of V.S. Naipaul somewhere in the house, but I've lost it somewhere in a box, so I couldn't bring it out for the video. Indeed, Naipaul's paternal grandfather had emigrated from India under British imperial rule to work as an indentured labourer in a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. He was, like so many people from India in this period, a de facto slave labourer in Euro-Atlantic empires. Despite this legacy, this very cruel legacy of the worst of British and European colonial imperialism, V.S. Naipaul made his way to Oxford University in the 1950s, where he seemed to perhaps use his clear skill with literature, his gift, and seemed to be making his way successfully. But he met the perhaps rather too common British aristocratic imperial condescension at Oxford University in perhaps not Oxford University's finest moment. Oxford University decided to fail the future Nobel laureate for his B. Lit degree, his Bachelor of Literature degree. Quite an irony there. V.S. Naipaul would later say that he hated Oxford. Yet he got a job at the BBC, broadcasting to the Caribbean immigrant community in Britain, and started writing at night time. He had a breakthrough with perhaps his best work, A House for Mr. Biswas, which had a lead character modelled on his father, his sort of immigrant father. It was a very personal story, and the writing of the book consumed Naipaul. In 1983, he recalled that the book took 3 years to write. It felt like a career, and there was a short period towards the end of the writing when I do believe I knew all or much of the book by heart. The labour ended, the book began to recede, and I found that I was unwilling to re-enter the world I had created, unwilling to expose myself again to the emotions that lay below the comedy. I became nervous of the book. I haven't read it since I passed the proofs in May 1961. There is a challenge and a cost to confronting these terrible memories, even if they're done with comedy. The Nobel Committee described Naipaul as Joseph Conrad's heir, the author of The Heart of Darkness. He was the analyst. Naipaul, that is, the Nobel Committee said, was the analyst of the destinies of empires in the moral sense, what they do to human beings. His authority as a narrator is grounded in the memory of what others have forgotten, the history of the vanquished. This quote might say more about the Nobel Committee's late realisation after the end of the Cold War of the West's long history of colonisation. Some critics did not think Naipaul was the best writer, the true heir of Joseph Conrad. Edward Said, the author of Orientalism and the American Palestinian writer who is, patron saint of so much post-colonial literature, said that Naipaul allowed himself quite consciously to be turned into a witness for the Western prosecution and promoted colonial mythologies. He said this in relation to a book that Naipaul wrote that criticised Arab cultural imperialism and its impact on the Indian world. It's not a book I've read. It's a controversial book, but I'm not going to enter into the debate about that here. Nevertheless, there is an interesting reflection by Naipaul in A Bend in the River about the burden of the past and confronting the burden of the past, like he did in his book, A House for Mr. Biswas. It isn't easy to turn your back on the past. It isn't something you can decide to do just like that. It is something you have to arm yourself for, or grief will ambush and destroy you. I've not been able to read enough Naipaul to really tell whether he's Joseph Conrad's heir or a witness for the Western prosecution, as Edward Said said. I suspect he's neither, but he is a profound reflector on the difficulty of writing and reckoning with the burden of the past and the sins of European colonial imperialism. In 2002, Imre Kertész, the Hungarian novelist, won the Nobel Prize. He wrote of his own personal, direct experience of surviving the Holocaust and later his descent from the regimes of Eastern Europe. He was the first Hungarian to win the Nobel Prize 3 years after Hungary joined NATO. Could it have been a coincidence? There hasn't been a Hungarian who's won the prize since, although one Hungarian writer, Laszlo Krasznahorkai, is regularly named as among the top tips for the next Nobel Prize. And if you go over to jeffrich.substack and sign up to my sign up to a free subscription to the Substack, you can get my list of 12 writers who are predicted at the moment to be among the top tips to win the 2024 Nobel Prize. So jeffrich.substack.com. Free to join, and of course you can take out a paid subscription if you want to dive a bit deeper. Kertész's writing was commended by the Nobel Committee for writing that upholds the fragile experience of the individual against the barbaric arbitrariness of history. He was a Hungarian Jew who survived deportation to the concentration camps. His best-known work, Fatelessness, describes the experience of a 15-year-old, Georgi Kjorves, in the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Birkenwald, Wald, and Zeitz. This formed part of a Holocaust trilogy, including Fiasco and Kaddish for an Unborn Child. In an interview, he said of Fatelessness that his challenge was to devise a language to describe the experience of totalitarianism. I wanted to examine the particular existence, the experience of life within a totalitarian system. It was not at all clear to me how I could go about that stylistically. I had to forge a language from scratch, one sufficiently strong and precise. Now, I have not read his Holocaust trilogy, but his writing is part of a set of writers known as Holocaust literature, including Tadeusz Borowski, Primo Levi, Jean Amoret, and the great poet Paul Celan. And many of those writers are described in this brilliant book by the Australian historian Inga Clendenin, now no longer with us, Inga Clendenin. Her book, which is a wonderful guide to the moral challenges of reading this literature and actually really reckoning with the past, really reckoning with the moral complexity of these terrible events. And I'm reading selections of that work in my audio mini-series at jeffrich.substack.com. If you go over and become a paid subscriber, you can listen to my audio book minis, including Inga Clendenin and Asa Berlin, and more to come. Now, Kertész's later novel Liquidation was set during the period of Hungary's evolution into a democracy from communist rule. And in that book, he wrote of a character, Kertész, that Kertész had believed in politics and politics had deceived him, the way politics deceives everyone. We can all learn from Kertész's insight into the real world of politics there. He wrote those thoughts, however, not in Hungary, but in Germany, where he lived for a long time, from, I think, the 1970s, from memory. He was one of many émigré East European writers honoured by the Nobel Prize for criticising their former regimes. He had a vexed relationship with Hungary. He referred to it as balkanised, but late in life, in 2014, he refused to play the games of Western journalists like the New York Times, where they wanted him, as the lion of Hungarian literature, to criticise Hungary as a dictatorship. He refused to do that, and the interview was cancelled. Nonetheless, in an interview, a video interview, which I've got a link in the video description below on YouTube, he referred to Hungary losing its chance to redefine its ideology and political views at the end of the Cold War. He said, "Of hatreds and sour stomachs one cannot create politics." He meant hatreds and sourness and resentment is no basis to build a consensus of cooperation, of commonality. And it's a wise thought. And if you want to read in particular of all those writers, my absolute favourite, Wisława Szymborska, the great, great Polish writer, and her wonderful poem, The End in the Beginning, go over to jeffrich.substack.com, and why don't you also just sample my reading of Szymborska in this video here, which is taken from a podcast about a year or so ago. Thanks for joining me. Do join me next week for the Nobel Literature Prize winners from 2003 to 2009.